On Christmas Eve, the church doors glowed with warmth. Outside, an old man was told the food was gone. He sat alone in the cold, staring at a Christmas tree he could not touch. Then Keanu Reeves saw him. What happened next changed a life no one remembered. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Christmas Eve arrived quietly wrapped in falling snow and soft yellow light. Outside a small neighborhood church, a line of people stretched along the sidewalk. Coats pulled tight, shoulders hunched against the cold. No one spoke much. Breath drifted upward in pale clouds, rising and disappearing into the dark like unanswered prayers. The building glowed with warmth. Light spilled through tall windows, carrying the muffled sound of hymns and gentle laughter. Inside, it was Christmas. Outside, it was survival. The line moved slowly, one step at a time. A shuffle of worn shoes on icy pavement. Volunteers near the doors worked quickly, their voices low, careful not to draw attention to the thinning trays behind them. Steam escaped each time the doors opened, carrying the smell of hot food into the night. It was enough to make empty stomachs tighten, enough to remind everyone waiting why they had come. Near the front stood an elderly man, thin and slightly bent, his gray hair visible beneath a frayed knit cap. His coat was too light for the weather, its sleeves shiny with age and use. His hands shook as he tucked them into his pockets, fingers stiff from the cold. He did not complain. He did not look around. He stared straight ahead, focused only on the doorway and what it represented. Warmth, a meal, a place to sit, even if only for a few minutes. When it was finally his turn, the volunteer hesitated. Her eyes flicked back toward the empty trays, then returned to the man's face. She spoke softly, almost apologetically. The food was gone. They had not expected so many people. She was sorry. Her words were gentle but final. The old man listened without changing expression. No anger crossed his face, no disappointment that could be easily named. He nodded once slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. Then he stepped aside, careful not to block the doorway, careful not to inconvenience anyone else who might still be hoping. He moved with the practiced awareness of someone used to staying out of the way. He lowered himself onto the stone steps just outside the church doors. The cold seeped through the fabric of his pants and into his bones. He sat there quietly, hands resting on his knees, shoulders rounded forward. Snow gathered on the edges of his coat unnoticed. Inside the church, voices rose together in song, full and warm. A Christmas hymn, familiar and bright. Through the glass doors he could see it. A Christmas tree stood just inside the entrance, tall and glowing. White lights wrapped around its branches reflected endlessly in the polished floor. Ornaments caught the light and shimmered. People passed by it, laughing softly, greeting one another, unaware of the man sitting just beyond the threshold. The contrast was sharp and unforgiving. Inside was belonging. Outside was absence. Inside was celebration. Outside was endurance. The man's eyes remained fixed on the tree, not with envy, but with something quieter, a remembering, a longing he did not allow himself to name. The warmth on the other side of the glass might as well have been another world. The old man stayed where he was, unmoving, as the line behind him continued to shift. A few people glanced at him, then quickly looked away, unsure whether to offer sympathy or respect his silence. The church doors opened and closed again, releasing brief waves of heat into the night, each one fading before it could reach him. The stone beneath him felt colder by the minute, but he did not stand. Standing would mean wandering again, and for now the steps were enough. He pulled his coat tighter, though it offered little protection. The fabric had thinned over the years, worn smooth at the elbows, the lining frayed. It was a coat that had lived many lives, much like its owner. Snow settled on his shoulders and melted slowly, darkening the cloth. His breath came shallow and steady, each exhale forming a fragile cloud that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. Inside, the hymn reached its chorus. The sound drifted through the glass, softened, but unmistakable. It carried memories he had not invited, but could not stop. a different church. Decades ago. A woman beside him, her hand warm in his. A small tree at home, decorated unevenly, their laughter filling the room as they argued over where to place the last ornament. Those images rose unbidden, sharp and sudden, then settled into something dull and heavy in his chest. He blinked slowly, grounding himself in the present. This was not the night for remembering too much. Remembering made the cold sharper. Remembering made hunger louder. He focused instead on the light from the tree, the way it reflected in the glass and fractured into dozens of small stars. For a moment it was almost enough. The volunteer who had turned him away lingered just inside the door, watching him through the glass. She looked torn hands clasped tightly in front of her. She wanted to help. He could see it in her eyes, but wanting did not create food. Wanting did not stretch resources. Eventually she turned back inside, swallowed again by warmth and sound. The old man did not follow her with his gaze. He understood. He always had. There were rules, limits, lines that could not be crossed even on Christmas Eve. He had learned long ago not to expect exceptions. Time passed slowly, measured only by the numbness creeping further into his fingers and toes. He shifted slightly, easing pressure on his hips, careful not to draw attention. Pride was a quiet companion, stubborn and persistent. It told him not to ask again, not to knock on the door, not to remind anyone that he was still there. Above him the church bells rang, announcing the hour. Their sound rolled out into the night, rich and full. Somewhere nearby a car passed, tires hissing on wet pavement. Life continued, indifferent and unstoppable. He lowered his gaze from the tree to the ground in front of him. The stone steps were etched with faint lines, worn smooth by countless feet over the years. He wondered how many other people had sat where he was now, how many had waited, how many had been seen. What he did not know was that he was no longer invisible. From the edge of the church grounds, someone had noticed the empty space where a meal should have been. Someone had seen the nod, the quiet acceptance, the way the man had stepped aside without protest. Someone had recognized the weight of that silence. And as the hymn reached its final notes inside a different kind of moment was beginning just beyond the light. The final notes of the hymn faded inside the church, replaced by soft applause and the rustle of coats as people prepared to leave. The doors opened wider now, releasing a steady stream of warmth and voices into the cold night. Laughter spilled out. Holiday greetings, plans for dinner, for family, for home. The old man remained seated, slightly hunched, his presence blending into the stone and shadow. Snow continued to fall, light but persistent, dusting the steps and the sidewalk beyond. A thin layer gathered on his boots, softening their worn edges. He did not brush it away. His body had grown used to enduring discomfort without complaint. The cold no longer shocked him. It simply existed like everything else. People passed by him on their way out, some noticing, some not. A few slowed, unsure whether to stop. Most kept moving, pulled forward by the promise of warmth, waiting elsewhere. The old man did not look up. He did not want pity. He did not want to explain. All he wanted was for the night to pass without becoming harder than it already was. Through the glass doors, the Christmas tree still glowed steady and patient. Its lights did not flicker. They did not fade. They stood as they always had, unchanged by who was allowed near them and who was not. The old man watched them one last time, committing the image to memory, knowing it might be another year before he saw something like it again. He shifted on the steps, preparing himself for what came next. When the church finally closed its doors for the night, he would stand, walk away, and find somewhere to wait until morning. That had been the plan. It was always the plan. What he could not see was the man who had just stepped outside and stopped short at the sight of him. A man who did not hurry past, a man who did not look away, a man whose eyes moved from the empty trays inside to the solitary figure on the steps and then stayed there. In that pause, quiet and unnoticed by everyone else, the night began to change. The old man remained on the church steps after the last hymn ended, as if movement itself required more energy than he could spare. He was close to 70, though the years had worn him unevenly. His face carried deep lines carved by weather and time, but his eyes were still clear, alert, quietly observant. He had learned to watch the world without asking anything of it. That habit had kept him alive. His coat hung loosely on his frame, too thin to block the winter cold. The fabric had lost its original color long ago, faded into a dull gray that blended easily with sidewalks and stone walls. At the cuffs, threads had come loose, brushed smooth by years of constant wear. Beneath the coat, his shoulders sloped forward, not from weakness alone, but from practice. Years of shrinking his presence, years of making himself smaller so no one would feel burdened by noticing him. His boots were worse. The soles were worn thin, the tread nearly gone, the leather cracked along the sides. Cold crept in through places that could no longer be sealed. Each winter made those cracks deeper. Still, he wore them carefully, stepping lightly, conserving what little warmth remained in his feet. He could tell by the numbness how long he had been sitting. He did not look down to check. He already knew. He folded his hands together in his lap, fingers interlaced, knuckles swollen and rough. The skin was dry, marked by scars that had stories behind them, though he rarely told them anymore. These hands had once been strong. They had carried weight. They had built things, fixed things held another person's hand without fear of letting go. Now they rested quietly, doing nothing, waiting. He did not beg. He never had. Begging required a kind of energy he did not possess anymore. It also required hope, the belief that someone might respond. Over time, hope had become something he rationed carefully, like food or warmth. He saved it for moments that mattered. Tonight did not feel like one of those moments. The lights from inside the church reflected faintly in his eyes. White and gold shapes shimmered across the glass, breaking apart and coming back together again. He watched them without blinking, letting the glow fill his vision. It reminded him of other lights long ago. A living room window, snow outside, a tree that leaned slightly to one side because the stand was uneven. The memories arrived quietly without warning. He saw himself younger, standing straighter, shoulders back. He wore a uniform then. It fit him well. He remembered the weight of it, the sense of purpose it gave him. People had looked at him differently in those days, with respect, with expectation. He had mattered. Then there was her, his wife. He could see her clearly even now. Her hair pulled back as she reached up to hang an ornament. The way she smiled when she caught him watching. The soft argument over where the tree should go. Those memories were sharp and warm at the same time, like holding something too close to a flame. He let the images fade before they could do too much damage. Remembering was dangerous. Remembering made the present harder to endure. He returned his focus to the steps beneath him, to the cold air filling his lungs, to the simple act of staying still. Hunger sat in his stomach, dull and persistent, but it was not the worst part. Hunger could be managed. Hunger came and went. What hurt more was the absence of being seen. On the one night meant for family, for gathering, for love, he had become part of the background again. A shape on the steps, a silence no one asked to break. Still he waited. He was not sure for what. Mourning, perhaps, or just the strength to stand when the time came. The cold pressed deeper as the minutes passed, but the old man did not shift much. Movement drew attention, and attention often came with questions he did not want to answer. He had learned that stillness was a kind of camouflage. If he stayed quiet enough, small enough, the world would pass over him without friction. It was not dignity exactly, but it was close enough to protect what little pride he had left. He had once believed life followed a clear path. Work hard, serve well, build a home, love deeply. For many years, that belief had been rewarded. He remembered the weight of keys in his pocket, the sound they made when he came home at night. He remembered the smell of coffee in the morning, the way his wife hummed while she cooked, always off-key, but confident. Those details stayed with him more clearly than the big moments ever had. When she died, everything became quieter, too quiet. Friends visited at first, bringing casseroles and condolences, promising to check in. They did for a while. Then life pulled them back to their own routines. Bills did not pause for grief. paperwork multiplied. He tried to manage it all, but the days blurred together. One missed payment became two. One bad decision followed another. Pride kept him from asking for help until asking felt impossible. The first night without a home had been the hardest. After that, the nights stacked on top of each other, indistinguishable, like identical pages in a book he no longer read. Shelters were crowded. Some nights were safer than others. He learned where to sit, where not to linger, how to make himself invisible when invisibility was the only protection available. Over time, he noticed how people looked through him rather than at him. Their eyes slid past, already busy with their own lives. Children stared, sometimes curious, before being gently steered away. Adults avoided eye contact, as if acknowledging him might create an obligation they were not prepared to fulfill. He did not blame them. Everyone carried something heavy. His just happened to be visible. Tonight felt heavier than most. Christmas Eve had a way of sharpening absence. The laughter spilling from the church doors cut more deeply because it was not cruel. It was simply complete without him. That was what hurt. Not rejection, but irrelevance. He was not denied because of who he was. He was denied because there was no room left. He clasped his hands tighter, pressing his fingers together until sensation returned, briefly, then faded again. His breath slowed steady and controlled. He counted silently, a habit he had developed long ago. Counting gave him something to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain. A gust of wind swept through the street, sending a fresh scatter of snow across the steps. He closed his eyes for a moment, conserving warmth. In the darkness behind his lids, the Christmas tree glowed brighter, more vivid than before. He saw his wife again, laughing as a strand of lights tangled around her wrist. He heard her voice telling him to be patient, that things always worked out in the end. When he opened his eyes, the tree was still there, just inside the glass. Unchanged, unaware. He wondered how many more Christmases he had left and whether any of them would feel different from this one. He did not dwell on the question for long. Dwelling led nowhere. Instead, he waited, as he always did, quietly, hoping for nothing specific, yet somehow still hoping all the same. The night deepened around him, the cold settling into a steady ache that matched the rhythm of his thoughts. He sat with his back straight, despite the years pulling him forward, refusing to fully collapse into the shape the world expected of him. Silence wrapped around him, thick but familiar, and he accepted it the way one accepts weather. He told himself this was only another evening. He had survived worse nights, longer nights without light or music nearby. Yet Christmas carried a different weight. It reminded him that once he had been expected somewhere, that once his absence would have been noticed. He glanced again at the glowing tree, then lowered his eyes, guarding the memory carefully. He did not know who he was waiting for, or why he had not yet stood to leave. Perhaps some part of him still believed the night had not finished speaking. Nearby footsteps slowed. Someone had paused. The old man did not look up. He had learned not to mistake coincidence for intention. But something shifted in the air, subtle and undeniable. For the first time in a long while, the silence around him felt different. Less. There. Inside the church, the service came to a gentle close. The final hymn faded, replaced by the soft shuffle of movement and low conversation. People turned toward one another with relaxed smiles, exchanging holiday wishes, brief hugs, quiet laughter. Coats were lifted from pewbacks. Gloves were pulled on. The warmth inside felt complete, self-contained, as if nothing beyond the walls could interrupt it. Keanu Reeves stood near the back, unremarkable in posture, his presence calm and contained. His coat was already buttoned, scarf tucked neatly at his neck. He kept his hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed, eyes lowered slightly as he waited for the flow of people to thin. He did not speak much. He did not linger. He had listened to the service with the same quiet attention he gave most things, taking in the words without needing to respond outwardly. As people passed him, a few nodded politely, unaware of who he was. In this place on this night, he was just another man attending a Christmas service, another figure moving toward the door with thoughts of the cold outside and the warmth waiting somewhere else. That anonymity suited him. It always had. When he stepped through the doors, the contrast struck immediately. Warm air gave way to sharp cold, the sound of voices dulled, replaced by the hush of falling snow and distant traffic. He paused, instinctively drawing a breath, as the temperature cut through his coat. Snowflakes brushed against his face, melting quickly, leaving a faint chill behind. He started down the steps, eyes adjusting to the darker street. That was when he saw him. The old man sat just to the side of the entrance, partially in shadow, his shape outlined by the glow spilling from the glass doors behind him. He was still almost unnaturally so, as if he had been there long enough to blend into the stone itself. Snow had gathered on his shoulders and the brim of his hat undisturbed. No one had brushed past him. No one had spoken to him. Keanu slowed without thinking. His steps shortened, then stopped altogether. His attention narrowed, drawn not by spectacle, but by absence. The man's hands were empty, resting loosely in his lap. No cup, no bag, no sign that he had received anything at all. His posture was folded inward, careful, practiced. He stared at the ground, avoiding the doorway, avoiding the people moving around him. Keanu recognized that posture immediately. It was the posture of someone who had learned how to disappear in plain sight. He did not need to ask what had happened. The details were written plainly enough. The untouched snow, the empty hands, the quiet acceptance. This man had waited, and when there was nothing left, he had stepped aside. He had not made a scene. He had not demanded attention. He had simply removed himself from the way. Something tightened in Keanu's chest, not sharply, but firmly. A familiar feeling. Not pity, not shock. Recognition. The kind that bypassed thought and settled directly into understanding. This was not about charity. This was about someone being left behind while the night moved on without him. Around them, people continued to exit the church, bundled and cheerful, unaware of the pause happening just beyond their path. Keanu remained still, his gaze fixed on the old man. In that moment, titles, names, and distance fell away. There was no actor and no audience. Only one man seeing another man sitting alone in the cold on Christmas Eve, and Keanu knew with absolute clarity that he could not walk past. Keanu stayed where he was for a few seconds longer, allowing the moment to settle instead of rushing through it. He watched as more people passed between him and the old man coats, brushing voices rising and falling in casual conversation. None of them stopped. None of them looked down long enough to really see what he was seeing. The night absorbed them and carried them away toward parked cars and warm homes. Keanu shifted slightly, turning his body so he was no longer facing the steps alone, but the man seated beside them. The cold seeped in now, sharp against his cheeks and hands, but he barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the small details. The way the old man's shoulders were rounded forward, not in weakness but in caution. The way his hands rested open empty, as if he had already accepted the outcome of the night. The way snow had begun to gather on his coat without being brushed away, signaling how long he had been sitting there without interruption. Keanu thought briefly of the service inside, of the words spoken about peace and goodwill, of the warmth everyone had shared, believing it complete. He understood in that moment how easy it was to feel generous when generosity did not require discomfort. How simple it was to celebrate love when everyone in the room already belonged. He took a step forward, then stopped again. He did not want to startle the man. He did not want to intrude in a way that felt sudden or overwhelming. He remembered times in his own life when silence had been a shield, when being approached too directly felt like an accusation rather than an offer. He respected that boundary. Another gust of wind swept across the steps, lifting loose snow and pressing it against the old man's coat. Keanu watched the man tense almost imperceptibly, then relax again as if bracing himself was no longer worth the effort. That small reaction settled something in Keanu's mind. This was not a moment to hesitate. He moved closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate, making sure they could be heard. The sound of his boots against the stone was quiet, but distinct enough to signal presence without demand. Still, the old man did not look up. His gaze remained lowered, fixed somewhere near his boots, as though meeting another person's eyes required more strength than he had left. Keanu stopped a few feet away, close enough to share the warmth that still clung faintly to his coat, far enough to respect the space between them. He did not speak yet. He allowed the silence to exist unforced patient. It was the kind of silence that did not push, that simply waited. In that pause, Keanu understood something important. This was not a problem to solve quickly. This was a person to meet where he was. The night had already taken enough from the man on the steps. It did not need to take his dignity too. Snow continued to fall around them, soft and steady, blurring the edges of the streetlights and muting the world beyond the church. For a moment, everything felt suspended. The service was over. The crowd was thinning. What remained was a quiet intersection between two lives that would not have crossed, if not for one simple thing. Keanu had noticed, and once noticed, there was no turning away. Keanu drew a slow breath, steadying himself not from the cold, but from the weight of what he had seen. He was aware of how easily this moment could be missed. One step faster, one glance in another direction, and the night would have closed behind him like a door. The thought stayed with him, heavy and unsettling. He looked again at the old man, taking in the stillness, the patience that bordered on resignation. This was not someone waiting to be saved. This was someone who had learned to endure, someone who expected nothing and prepared himself for less. That realization mattered. It shaped what came next. Keanu shifted his stance slightly, angling his body so he was no longer blocking the church entrance. He did not want to appear as part of the flow of people leaving. He wanted to be separate from it, present. The snow brushed against his hair and shoulders, now beginning to settle, making him look no different from the man sitting a few feet away. For a brief moment, Keanu hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of care. He wanted to approach in the right way, not as a stranger imposing kindness, not as someone assuming need, just as one human acknowledging another. The old man finally sensed the presence beside him, noticed the shadow where there had not been one before. He lifted his eyes slightly, just enough to register that someone was standing there, then lowered them again. No challenge, no expectation, just awareness. That small movement confirmed everything. Keanu felt the decision settle fully, firmly. This was not a coincidence. This was not an interruption. This was an invitation. Behind them, the church doors closed softly, sealing in the warmth and the music. The glow remained through the glass, but the sound faded. Outside, the street felt quieter, more intimate. The world narrowed to the space between the standing man and the seated one. Keanu took one more step forward, close enough now that the cold between them began to matter less. And in that quiet space, before a single word was spoken, something rare happened. Someone who had been unseen for a very long time was about to be acknowledged. Keanu did not speak. He did not clear his throat or announce himself. Words would have broken the shape of the moment, and he understood that instinctively. Instead, he reached up and slowly unbuttoned his coat, his movements deliberate and calm, as if time itself had softened around them. The old man noticed the motion out of the corner of his eye and stiffened slightly. Surprise flickered across his face, followed quickly by embarrassment. His shoulders drew in, a reflex formed by years of not wanting to take more space than necessary. He started to shake his head, a small movement meant to say no without saying anything at all. Keanu stepped closer before the refusal could fully form. He lowered himself down, bending one knee, then the other, until he was level with the old man's eyes. Not towering, not looming, just present, at the same height, sharing the cold, sharing the moment. He lifted the coat and gently settled it over the man's shoulders. The fabric was warm. It carried the faint, clean scent of soap and something sharper underneath pine, like the inside of a Christmas box just opened. The coat was heavier than the one the old man wore, thicker, lined properly. As it touched his back, the old man inhaled sharply, the breath catching, before he could stop it. Warmth spread slowly, not all at once, but enough to register. enough to surprise him. For a moment his hands twitched uncertainly in his lap, unsure what to do. Then they stilled. The shaking that had lived there for most of the night eased, not disappearing completely, but retreating. His fingers relaxed, uncurling slightly, as if they had finally been given permission to rest. Keanu adjusted the collar carefully, making sure it sat comfortably, making sure the coat did not feel like it might slide off and need to be returned. He was careful with the edges, mindful not to brush the man's face or crowd his space. Every movement carried intention without urgency. The old man's first instinct was to protest. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Words felt too big, too heavy. He had learned that refusing kindness sometimes required more explanation than he had strength to give. Instead, he looked down at the coat, now covering him, then slowly lifted his gaze to Keanu's face. Their eyes met. There was no urgency there, no pity, no expectation of gratitude, just calm recognition. A quiet acknowledgement that something necessary was happening and that it did not need to be justified. Snow continued to fall around them, brushing against Keanu's uncovered shoulders now. He felt the cold more clearly without the coat, but he did not react to it. The exchange had already been made. Warmth had been transferred. Not borrowed, not loaned, given. People still passed nearby, but fewer now. Most had gone. Those who remained were distant, their conversations muted their attention elsewhere. There were no phones raised. No pauses, no sudden awareness of who Keanu was. This moment belonged only to the two of them. The old man swallowed his throat tight. He pulled the coat a little closer around himself, careful not to tug too hard, as if afraid it might be taken back if he held it incorrectly. His shoulders lowered by a fraction. The tension he carried loosened just enough to breathe differently. Keanu remained kneeling steady and patient, as if there was nowhere else he needed to be. As if Christmas Eve had narrowed to this single exchange, and without a single word spoken, something essential had already changed. The old man sat very still, as though sudden movement might undo what had just happened. The coat rested on his shoulders with a weight that felt unfamiliar, almost startling. Not heavy in a burdensome way, but grounding. Real. He shifted slightly, testing it, feeling the lining settle against his back and arms. Warmth spread inward, slow and deliberate, reaching places the cold had claimed long ago. Keanu stayed kneeling close enough to share the space, but not crowd it. His hands rested loosely on his own knees, now empty, relaxed. He did not rush to stand. He did not speak. He allowed the silence to remain intact, unbroken, and respectful. It was the kind of silence that did not demand anything in return. The old man's breathing changed first. It deepened, grew more even. The shallow, careful breaths he had been taking gave way to something steadier. His shoulders rose and fell in a rhythm he had almost forgotten. The cold had been loud before, insistent, dominating every thought. Now it receded just enough to make room for something else. He glanced down at his hands again, surprised to see them resting quietly instead of trembling. He flexed his fingers once slowly, as if testing whether they still belonged to him. They did. They felt warmer, more responsive. He pressed his palms together briefly, then let them rest apart again, marveling at the small change. Embarrassment crept in next, soft but persistent. He had not asked for this. He had not wanted to impose. He searched for words that might explain that might insist Keanu keep his coat, that this was too much. But the words refused to form. Gratitude and pride collided somewhere in his chest, tangling together until neither could speak clearly. Keanu sensed the shift. He offered a small nod, subtle and reassuring, as if to say there was nothing to explain, nothing owed. His expression remained open, unguarded. He was not watching for a reaction. He was simply present. Snow gathered more noticeably on Keanu's hair, now dusting his shoulders, clinging to the fabric of his sweater. The cold reached him fully sharp and immediate, but he did not flinch. He had chosen this exchange knowingly. The discomfort was brief. The impact was not. A distant car passed headlights, sweeping briefly across the steps, illuminating them both in pale white light. For a moment, the scene looked almost staged. Two figures on church steps, one kneeling, one seated, a coat bridging the space between them. Then the light moved on, and the moment settled back into quiet anonymity. The old man finally lifted his chin a little higher, meeting Keanu's gaze again. This time he held it. There was confusion there, gratitude, a flicker of disbelief. He searched Keanu's face for some hidden expectation, some signal that this kindness came with conditions. He found none. Instead, he saw patience, calm, a steadiness that suggested this act was not extraordinary to the man offering it. That understanding did something unexpected. It eased the old man's shame. He drew the coat closer, not possessively, but protectively, as if it were something fragile. His voice hovered at the edge of his throat, still unspoken. Perhaps words would come later. Perhaps they were not needed at all. Keanu remained where he was, sharing the cold, now sharing the night. He understood that this moment was not about fixing anything yet. It was about acknowledging what had already happened, about refusing to let silence be the final answer. Around them, Christmas Eve continued. Snow fell. Lights glowed. Somewhere inside the church, the last of the volunteers finished cleaning up, unaware of the quiet exchange unfolding just outside. And on those steps, warmth moved from one person to another, carrying with it something far greater than heat. The old man let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. It left him slowly visibly, as if something tight inside his chest had finally loosened. He nodded once, small, and restrained the only response he could manage without risking his composure. His eyes burned slightly, but he blinked the feeling away. He had learned long ago not to let emotion spill where it might draw attention. Keanu rose carefully from his kneeling position, not abruptly, not as if the moment had ended, but as if it had simply reached a natural pause. He stepped back half a pace, giving the old man space again, trusting him with the gift without hovering over it. The message was clear without being stated. This was yours now. The cold wrapped around Keanu immediately sharper, without the coat, but he welcomed it. It reminded him that the exchange had been real, that something tangible had changed hands. He tucked his hands into his pockets and stood quietly beside the steps for a moment longer, sharing the night. The old man adjusted the coat once more, settling into it fully. He sat a little straighter now, not proudly, just more present. The weight on his shoulders no longer felt like something to endure. Nothing else was required. No thanks, no explanation. Christmas did not demand words, and in the falling snow on those worn church steps, kindness had already spoken clearly enough. For a few moments after the coat settled into place, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. Snow continued to fall soft and steady, filling the gaps where words might have gone. Keanu stood beside the steps, hands in his pockets, now shoulders squared against the cold. The old man remained seated, his posture slightly changed, less folded than before. Keanu was the first to speak, and when he did, his voice was low and even, carrying no urgency. He did not ask who the man was. He did not ask how he had ended up there. He asked only what mattered in that moment. "Are you hungry?" The question was simple, honest. It landed without judgment. The old man did not answer right away. He stared at the ground between his boots, considering the safest response. Hunger was an admission. Hunger meant need. He had learned to keep such things close guarded. After a moment, he nodded once, just enough to be truthful without saying too much. Keanu waited. He did not fill the space. He allowed the answer to exist on its own. Then he asked another question, just as gently. "Do you have somewhere warm tonight?" This time, the hesitation lasted longer. The old man's jaw tightened slightly. His eyes lifted, then dropped again. He swallowed. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and rough-shaped by disuse and cold. "No," he said. "Shelter's full. Food's gone." He did not add anything else. He did not complain. He did not explain how many nights he had heard the same words or how familiar they had become. The facts were enough. The night would be long. The cold would deepen. Morning was still far away. Keanu nodded slowly, absorbing the truth without reacting outwardly. There was no surprise in his expression, no frustration, just understanding. He glanced briefly down the street, where a few storefronts still glowed dimly, their lights cutting through the falling snow. "There's a place still open," he said after a moment. "Not fancy, just warm." The old man frowned slightly, confusion mixing with caution. He shifted on the step, fingers curling unconsciously into the sleeves of the coat. "I don't need charity," he said quickly, the words tumbling out faster than he intended. This is enough." Keanu shook his head once, small and calm. "I'm not offering charity," he said. "Just dinner. We can eat together." The distinction mattered. The old man felt it immediately, though he did not fully understand why. Together meant something different. Together meant he would not be seated alone, watched, pitied, or rushed. Together meant conversation or silence shared by choice. Still, reluctance lingered. He had accepted the coat because refusing it had felt impossible. Accepting dinner felt heavier, more visible. He imagined the looks, the questions, the unspoken assumptions. Keanu seemed to sense the struggle. He did not push. He simply waited, hands still in his pockets, shoulders beginning to collect snow again. He was already cold. He did not mention it. Finally, exhaustion tipped the balance. The old man nodded again, slower this time, more deliberate. "All right," he said quietly. "If you're sure." Keanu smiled, not broadly, not performatively, but enough to soften the space between them. "I'm sure." The old man stood carefully, steadying himself as he rose. Keanu stayed close, not to guide him, but to match his pace. Side by side, they turned away from the church steps and began to walk down the street, their footprints forming briefly in the snow before fading. Two figures moving into the Christmas night. Not rescuer and rescued, just two men heading somewhere warm. They walked slowly at first, adjusting to one another's pace without saying so. The old man's steps were measured, careful, shaped by years of navigating icy sidewalks and uneven ground. Keanu matched him instinctively, shortening his stride, letting the night set the rhythm. Snow crunched softly beneath their boots, the sound steady and grounding. Neither of them spoke right away. The decision had been made. Words could wait. Streetlights lined the road ahead, their glow softened by falling snow, turning the city into something quieter, almost gentle. Windows passed by, some dark, some bright, with holiday decorations. Wreaths, lights, a television flickering behind drawn curtains. Small glimpses of lives unfolding elsewhere. The old man kept his hands tucked inside the coat sleeves, feeling the warmth gather around his wrists. He was aware of how he must look, walking beside Keanu, aware of the contrast between them, and yet strangely less self-conscious than he had been moments before. The way Keanu walked unhurried and unconcerned made it harder to feel like a burden. After a block or two, the old man spoke again, his voice tentative. "You don't have to do this," he said, not accusatory, just honest. "I'm used to it." Keanu glanced at him briefly, then back to the path ahead. "I know," he said. "That doesn't mean you should have to be." The answer was simple, offered without drama. It left little room for argument. The old man nodded, absorbing it quietly. He had heard many words over the years. Promises, excuses, well-meaning phrases that dissolved by morning. This felt different, not because it was grand, but because it was present. They reached an intersection where traffic thinned and the city felt smaller. A sign ahead glowed red and blue, marking a modest diner, still open, its windows fogged from heat and cooking. A single Christmas decoration hung near the entrance, slightly crooked, taped in place. The old man slowed, uncertainty returning. He stopped just short of the door. "You sure?" he asked again, softer now. Keanu turned to face him fully this time. Snow clung to his hair and shoulders, his breath visible in the cold air. He met the old man's eyes steadily. "I wouldn't have walked you this far if I wasn't." That settled it. The old man nodded and followed him inside. Warm air wrapped around them, immediately thick with the smell of coffee and fried food. The sound of a bell announced their arrival, and a few heads turned briefly before returning to their meals. No stares lingered, no questions were asked. To everyone else, they were just two men coming in from the cold. They paused near the entrance for a moment, letting the warmth sink in. The old man exhaled slowly, shoulders relaxing again as sensation returned to his fingers. Keanu waited, giving him time. A small Christmas tree stood near the window, lights blinking softly. The old man noticed it at once, his gaze drawn to it without effort. He stopped just for a second, taking it in. The glow, the ornaments, the simple fact of it. Keanu followed his gaze, understood without comment, and gestured toward a booth nearby. "Let's sit," he said. They moved toward the table together, coats brushing footsteps, quiet against the tiled floor. Outside, snow continued to fall, erasing their tracks from the sidewalk. Inside, warmth and light closed around them, and for the first time that night, the old man allowed himself to believe the cold might not define the hours ahead. They slid into the booth by the window, the vinyl seat cool. At first, then quickly warming beneath them. The old man sat carefully, placing his hands on the table, as if to steady himself, as if this warmth might vanish if he moved too suddenly. Keanu took the seat across from him, relaxed, unhurried, making no effort to control the space. A waitress approached, smiling out of habit, more than obligation. Keanu ordered simply, nothing elaborate. 2 warm meals, coffee, the kind of order that assumed time, not haste. The waitress nodded and walked away without another glance. The old man watched her go, then looked down at the table, his fingers tracing a faint scratch in the wood. He felt exposed and safe at the same time, a combination he had not experienced in years. He swallowed, searching for words that would not sound too much like thanks. "Didn't expect this," he said quietly. Keanu nodded once. "I know, that was all. No explanation, no justification." The old man leaned back slightly, the coat still wrapped around him, the Christmas tree lights reflecting faintly in the window beside them. Outside, snow pressed gently against the glass. Inside, heat and light held steady. For the first time that night, he stopped counting the hours until morning. The night was no longer something to survive. It was something he was moving through. The diner was small and unremarkable, the kind of place most people passed without a second thought. Its sign flickered slightly above the door, casting a soft red glow onto the snow-covered sidewalk. Inside, the warmth hit them immediately, thick and comforting, carrying the smells of coffee, grilled onions, and something sweet baked earlier in the day. It was not festive in the polished sense, but it was alive. They moved further inside past the counter and into the row of vinyl booths lining the window. The seats were worn, patched in places, with mismatched vinyl but clean. The floor tiles were scuffed from decades of boots and shoes. Somewhere near the back, an old radio played quietly, the sound thin but familiar. A Christmas song slowed by age and static. Near the window stood the Christmas tree. It was not tall. It leaned slightly to the left, propped up by a metal stand that did its best to keep it steady. The lights were unevenly wrapped, some areas glowing brightly, others barely touched. The ornaments were mismatched and clearly collected over time. A few plastic balls, one handmade paper star. Tinsel draped without much precision. It was obvious the staff had decorated it quickly between orders with whatever they had on hand. And yet it glowed. The old man noticed it immediately. His eyes lifted without effort, drawn to the soft light, as if it were magnetic. He stopped walking for a moment, just long enough to take it in fully. The tree stood only a few feet from the booth Keanu had gestured toward. Close enough that its lights reflected gently in the window beside it. They slid into the booth nearest the tree. Keanu took the seat facing the window, leaving the seat closest to the tree for the old man without comment. The old man sat carefully, setting his hands on the table before him, palms down as if grounding himself in the reality of where he was. Steam rose from the coffee cups when the waitress set them down a moment later. The old man wrapped his hands around the mug immediately, feeling the heat seep into his fingers. He closed his eyes briefly, breathing in the scent. The warmth traveled slowly, easing the ache that had settled into his joints outside. Keanu watched quietly, saying nothing, allowing the moment to unfold at its own pace. Outside the window, snow continued to fall, the streetlights blurring into soft halos. Inside, the diner hummed gently with low conversation and the clink of utensils. No one paid them special attention. No one stared. The old man opened his eyes again and looked at the tree. Its lights reflected faintly in the dark glass, doubling themselves. For a moment, his expression softened into something almost unrecognizable. Not joy, exactly. Something quieter. Something tender. He did not say it out loud, not yet, but the feeling settled deeply in his chest. He was sitting beside a Christmas tree. It had been a very long time since that had last been true. The coffee warmed the old man's hands, slowly, deliberately, as if his body needed time to remember how to accept comfort. He kept the mug cupped between his palms, letting the heat sink in before taking a sip. When he finally did, he paused, surprised by how strong the sensation felt. Simple things hit harder when they had been absent for too long. The diner settled into a quiet rhythm around them. A cook moved behind the counter spatula, scraping against the grill in steady intervals. Plates clinked softly. Somewhere, the radio shifted into another song, the melody familiar enough to hum along to, though no one did. It felt like a place that had learned how to stay open for people who had nowhere else to go. The old man's gaze kept drifting back to the tree. He tried not to stare, aware of how it might look, but the pull was stronger than caution. The lights were not bright. They did not flash. They simply stayed on, patient and constant. One of the bulbs near the bottom flickered slightly, then steadied itself again. That small imperfection made it feel real. Keanu noticed the man's attention without drawing focus to it. He leaned back slightly in the booth, giving the old man room to experience the moment without commentary. The quiet between them felt natural now, no longer something to navigate carefully. It existed without pressure. The waitress returned with menus, placing them on the table with an easy smile. Keanu glanced at the old man before opening his own. "Anything you don't eat?" he asked simply. The old man shook his head. "Anything warm is fine." There was no shame in the answer, just honesty. Keanu nodded and ordered for both of them, choosing uncomplicated food, the kind meant to fill, not impress. The waitress scribbled the order and moved on. While they waited, the old man shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting the coat again, still half expecting to be told it was time to give it back. When that did not happen, he relaxed a little more, letting himself sink into the vinyl cushion. He glanced out the window at the snow-covered street. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights blurring into streaks of white and red. People hurried along the sidewalks, callers turned up arms full of packages or food containers. Everyone seemed to be going somewhere specific. He felt separate from that rush, but not isolated from it. For once, he was not watching from the outside alone. His eyes returned to the tree, and something inside him shifted. A memory surfaced, unbidden but gentle. A small apartment long ago. A tree that leaned even more than this one. A string of lights that went out halfway through December. He remembered sitting on the floor beside it, fixing the bulbs, while his wife laughed and handed him ornaments one by one. He remembered the sound of music playing too loud from an old radio. The memory did not hurt the way it once had. It ached, but softly, like a muscle stretching after being unused. He did not pull away from it this time. He let it sit with him. Keanu watched him quietly, sensing the weight of the moment without needing its details. He understood that this tree was doing something words could not, that it was offering a bridge between what had been lost and what was still possible. When the food finally arrived, steam rising from the plates, the old man barely noticed at first. His attention lingered on the glow beside him, on the simple fact that he was warm, seated, and no longer alone on Christmas Eve. The tree stood there silent and uneven, doing its work without effort. And without realizing it yet, the old man had already begun to mark this moment as something he would carry with him long after the night ended. The old man finally took his eyes off the tree long enough to lift his coffee again. He drank more slowly now, savoring the warmth instead of chasing it. His shoulders eased back against the booth, and for the first time that night, his body stopped bracing for what might be taken away. The diner felt steady, solid, like it would remain exactly as it was for as long as he needed it to. Keanu noticed the shift. The man's breathing had settled. The tension in his jaw had softened. He was still quiet, still guarded, but the sharp edge of survival had dulled. This was not rescue. This was rest. Outside, snow thickened against the window, muting the street even further. The Christmas tree lights reflected in the glass, overlapping with the falling flakes, until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. The effect was almost dreamlike. The old man watched it for a moment, then allowed himself a small, private smile. He cleared his throat as if testing his voice. "Used to have one like that," he said, nodding gently toward the tree. "Didn't look much better either." Keanu smiled softly. "Those are usually the best ones." The old man nodded in agreement. No explanation followed. None was needed. When the food plates were finally cleared and the coffee cups refilled, the tree still stood beside them, unchanged. Its presence anchored the moment. The old man rested his hand briefly on the edge of the table nearest it, close enough to feel its glow without touching it, as if proximity alone mattered. He did not know it yet, but this tree would stay with him long after the diner lights dimmed. It would become a marker in his memory. The Christmas when he was no longer outside looking in. For now, he simply sat beside it, warm and quiet, letting the night hold him in a way it had not done for many years. The plates arrived quietly, set down with care. Steam lifted from the food in slow curls, carrying warmth and a familiar scent that filled the small space between them. The old man looked at the plate for a moment before touching it as if confirming it was real. Then he picked up his fork and began to eat. He ate slowly. Not out of hesitation, but intention. Each bite was measured, deliberate, and almost reverent. He chewed carefully, pausing between mouthfuls, letting the heat and taste settle. It had been a long time since he had eaten without watching the clock or the door. A long time since he had felt allowed to take his time. Keanu did not rush him. He did not fill the silence with encouragement or questions. He ate at his own pace, occasionally lifting his cup of coffee, letting the quiet remain comfortable. The old man noticed that. It mattered. Being allowed to eat without being observed too closely restored something small but essential. After a few minutes, Keanu spoke casually, as if they had always been sitting there together. "Cold night," he said. The old man nodded. "Colder than last year." Keanu smiled faintly. "Seems like it gets sharper every winter." "Feels that way," the old man agreed. They spoke about the weather for a while. About how snow used to feel different when you were younger. About how coffee tasted better when your hands were numb. About the diner itself. The old man mentioned he had passed it before, late at night, lights always on. "Owner keeps it open," he said. "Says nobody should have to sit outside all night if there's a stove still warm." Keanu nodded, thoughtful. "That's a good rule." The old man took another bite, then another. Color returned slowly to his face. His shoulders eased. The plate grew lighter. He glanced up occasionally now, no longer keeping his eyes fixed on the food, no longer guarding the moment so closely. "You come here often?" he asked Keanu, curiosity edging into his voice. "Sometimes," Keanu said. "Usually when I want somewhere quiet." The answer seemed to satisfy him. It did not invite questions. It did not raise them either. They sat like that, talking about small things. The radio, the tree by the window. How the lights reflected differently, depending on where you sat. The old man mentioned he liked that the ornaments didn't match. "Makes it feel honest," he said. Keanu smiled. "I was thinking the same thing." With each exchange, the old man spoke a little more freely. His voice grew steadier. He no longer rushed his words or swallowed them halfway through. Trust did not arrive all at once. It built slowly, sentence by sentence, like warmth spreading through the hands that had been cold too long. Halfway through the meal, he paused, fork resting on the edge of the plate. "Haven't eaten like this in a while," he said quietly. Keanu looked at him, attentive but unintrusive. "I'm glad you're here," he said. The old man nodded, eyes lowered again, but this time without shame. Just acknowledgement. He took another bite, then another. The meal continued unhurried, unremarkable in every way that mattered. And with every moment that passed, the space between them felt less like a gap and more like shared ground. As the plate slowly emptied, the old man's movements grew more relaxed. He no longer hovered over the food as if afraid it might disappear. He leaned back slightly between bites, letting the warmth settle deeper into his body. The diner sounds blended into a steady backdrop, no longer sharp or distracting. For him, the world had narrowed to the table, the tree by the window, and the man sitting across from him. Keanu took his cues from that shift. He did not steer the conversation. He followed it. When the old man spoke, Keanu listened fully, not with the intensity that made people self-conscious, but with an ease that invited continuation. "Coffee's better here than most places," the old man said after a sip, considering the cup. Keanu nodded. "Strong enough to do some good." The old man allowed himself a quiet chuckle at that, the sound rough, but genuine. It surprised him, and he paused for a moment after, as if testing whether laughter was still something he was allowed to have. When nothing bad followed it, he relaxed again. He glanced toward the counter where the cook wiped his hands on a towel and spoke briefly with the waitress. "They don't rush people here," he said. "Some places do. You can feel it. Like you're on a timer." "I've noticed that," Keanu replied. "This place feels patient." "Yeah," the old man said. "Patient's a good word." That word lingered with him. Patient. It described the diner, the tree, the man across from him. It described something he had not felt in a long time. He took another bite, then set his fork down, looking thoughtful. "Used to be different for me," he said, not looking up yet. "Didn't always live like this." Keanu did not interrupt. He did not rush to reassure. He simply waited. The old man cleared his throat. "Had a job once. Regular hours. Place to go home to?" He gestured vaguely as if pointing to something just beyond the walls. Funny how fast that can disappear. Keanu nodded once, slow and understanding. "It can." The old man finally looked up, meeting Keanu's eyes. There was no challenge there, just honesty. "People think it's one bad choice," he continued. "But it's not. It's a lot of small ones, some of them not even yours." "That makes sense," Keanu said. The simplicity of the response seemed to steady him. The old man exhaled, shoulders dropping a fraction. He had expected questions, explanations, judgment. Instead, he found none. He picked up his fork again, finishing the last of his meal. When the plate was empty, he sat back and rested his hands on the table, palms open. It was a small gesture, but meaningful. He was no longer guarding himself as tightly. "Thanks," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "For sitting, not just the food." Keanu met his gaze. "I'm glad we're here," he said again, just as simply as before. The old man nodded, absorbing that. Dignity, he realized, was not something given all at once. It was restored slowly, in being listened to, in being allowed to speak at his own pace, in being treated as someone worth the time. The tree lights blinked softly beside them, steady and imperfect. And with each sentence spoken, the distance the old man had carried inside him grew just a little smaller. The waitress returned quietly to clear the plates, moving with the same unhurried rhythm as everything else in the diner. She asked if they wanted more coffee. Keanu nodded. The old man hesitated, then nodded too, a little unsure, as if still adjusting to being included in the decision. Fresh mugs were placed in front of them, steam rising again, renewing the warmth between their hands. The old man wrapped his fingers around the cup and sat with it for a moment without drinking. He seemed to be choosing his next words carefully. "Don't usually talk this much," he said. "Gets easier not to." Keanu did not contradict him. "Sometimes silence feels safer," he said. The old man considered that, then nodded. "Yeah, safer, but lonely." The word landed gently without bitterness. Just truth. Outside, the snow continued to fall thick now, muffling the world beyond the glass. Inside the Christmas tree, lights reflected off the table's worn surface, creating small pools of color that shifted as people moved. The old man watched them, then spoke again, his voice steadier. "Feels different tonight," he said. "Sitting here, being asked things." Keanu held his gaze. "You deserve that." The old man did not respond right away. He swallowed emotion flickering briefly across his face before he brought it back under control. He nodded once, slowly accepting the statement without argument. They sat in companionable quiet after that, sipping coffee, sharing the space without pressure. The meal was finished, but its effect lingered. Hunger had been satisfied, yes, but something deeper had been fed. The need to be seen, to be heard without interruption, to exist without apology. When the old man finally leaned back in the booth, he did so with a different posture than before. Still careful, still reserved, but no longer folded inward. He glanced once more at the tree beside them, then back at Keanu. "Glad you noticed me," he said quietly. Keanu met his eyes. "I'm glad you were there to be noticed." The old man nodded, holding on to that thought, as the coffee cooled and the night outside pressed on. For the first time in a long while, he felt full in a way that had nothing to do with food. The conversation drifted into another quiet pause, the kind that no longer felt empty. The old man stared into his coffee for a long moment, watching the faint ripples settle. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, more deliberate, as if he were stepping carefully into a room he had kept locked for years. "I used to serve," he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. He did not say them with pride or bitterness, just fact. Keanu did not react outwardly. He did not straighten or ask questions right away. He simply nodded, inviting the story without pressing for it. "Army," the old man continued after a breath. "Long time ago now, did my years, came back, tried to do things the right way." He spoke slowly, choosing each sentence as if it needed to earn its place. He told Keanu about coming home, about how strange it felt to return to ordinary life after years of structure and command, how he had learned to sleep without noise again, how he found work, how he met his wife not long after, a woman who laughed easily and believed deeply in routines. Sunday dinners, grocery lists, a tree every Christmas even in lean years. "We weren't rich," he said, "but we were steady." That steadiness, he explained, had been everything. A small house, a job that paid the bills, a life that moved forward quietly without asking for attention. He liked it that way. After years of being told where to stand and what to do, peace had felt like success. Then his wife got sick. He did not describe the illness in detail. He did not need to. The word sick carried enough history with it. Doctor visits turned into hospital stays. Savings thinned. Time off work became unpaid. He stayed strong for her, or at least tried to. He learned how to measure days in medication schedules and nights in waiting rooms. When she passed, the world did not stop. That was the part that surprised him the most. People brought food at first, cards, condolences. Then they went back to their lives. Bills did not slow down. Letters kept coming. He tried to keep up, but grief was heavier than he expected. It dulled his attention. He missed deadlines, lost track of paperwork. Important documents were misplaced in boxes he never fully unpacked. "I kept thinking I'd catch up," he said. "Just needed one good month. One good month never came." Without realizing it, he fell behind. Rent, utilities, fees that multiplied quietly in the background. Pride stopped him from asking for help. He had been trained to endure, to handle things himself, to not complain. Admitting he was drowning felt like a kind of failure he could not name but could not escape. He stared down at his hands as he spoke, flexing his fingers once, then letting them rest again. "I didn't think it would last," he said. "Didn't think one bad year could turn into this." Keanu listened without interruption, his attention steady and full. He did not try to soften the story or interrupt its shape. He allowed the truth to remain intact. The old man took a breath, steadying himself. "But it wasn't 1 year," he said quietly. "It was 20. He let that number sit between them. 20 years of erosion, of slipping a little further each season, of losing addresses, then IDs, then phone numbers, of becoming harder to recognize on paper even when he still knew who he was inside. Each Christmas passed more quietly than the last. No tree, no plate set across from him, no one saying his name out loud. It wasn't one big fall," he said, "just wearing down." The diner remained steady around them. The tree lights blinked softly. Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside, a man finally allowed his story to exist in the open, not as a confession, but as a record. And for the first time in a long while, it was being heard. He paused after saying it 20, as if the number itself surprised him all over again. His eyes lifted briefly toward the Christmas tree by the window, then drifted back down to the table. The lights reflected faintly in the surface of his coffee, small and distant, like memories that no longer felt fully his. "I didn't wake up one day homeless," he continued. "It happened in pieces." He described how pride kept him quiet, how he told himself asking for help would only be temporary, that he would fix things first and explain later. Later never arrived. Without proper documents, doors closed quickly. Jobs required paperwork he could not replace easily. Assistance programs asked for forms and addresses he no longer had. Each setback made the next one harder to face. He learned how to live with less than that. He learned which places let him sit without being told to move, which nights were safer than others, which holidays were the hardest to get through. Christmas stood out among them all. "Everything reminds you of what you don't have," he said. Families, tables, names being called. He spoke about Christmases spent walking past windows, seeing trees lit from inside warm rooms, how the smell of food carried farther in winter, how silence felt louder on those nights. He stopped going near churches after a while, not because he blamed them, but because hope hurt too much when it had nowhere to land. Keanu remained still, absorbing every word. He did not interrupt when the man's voice wavered briefly, then steadied again. He did not rush him past the pain or linger on it. He allowed the story to unfold at its own pace. "I knew who I was," the old man said, "but after a while nobody else did. That loss," he explained, "was harder than hunger, harder than cold. When no one says your name, when no one expects you anywhere, it becomes easier to disappear. Not physically, internally." He glanced at Keanu, then almost uncertain. "I didn't fail," he said quietly. "I just wore down." Keanu nodded once firmly. "That matters." The old man exhaled relief, visible in the movement of his shoulders. Being understood, even in that small way, felt like something loosening inside him. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing footprints as quickly as they were made. Inside, a story that had been eroded by time was being spoken whole again. For the first time in many years, the old man felt like his life had not vanished. It had simply been waiting for someone willing to listen long enough to see it clearly. When the old man finished speaking, the diner did not rush to fill the space he left behind. The radio hummed softly. Dishes clinked somewhere near the counter. The Christmas tree lights blinked in their uneven rhythm beside the window. Keanu remained still, his attention fixed on the man across from him, not searching for the next thing to say, not preparing a response meant to repair what had been broken. He simply listened. There was no interruption, no advice offered, no sudden shift toward solutions. Keanu's posture stayed open, relaxed, grounded. His hands rested loosely on the table, fingers still as if he understood that movement might pull focus away from the moment. His eyes did not drift. They stayed present, steady, patient. The old man noticed that before he noticed anything else. He had grown used to reactions when he spoke. People tensing, people nodding too quickly, people jumping ahead to suggestions, to resources, to ways to make the discomfort end sooner. This was different. Keanu was not trying to move the story forward or close it neatly. He was allowing it to exist exactly where it was. The old man shifted slightly in his seat, suddenly aware of how much he had shared. A familiar self-consciousness crept in. He cleared his throat. "Sorry," he said quietly. "Didn't mean to go on like that." Keanu shook his head once, slow and deliberate, not dismissive, reassuring. "You weren't going on," he said. "You were telling your story." The words landed gently, but they stayed. The old man blinked, caught off guard by how simply they were offered. He looked down at his hands again, then back up, uncertain what to do with the feeling rising in his chest. He nodded once, accepting the response without trying to deflect it further. They sat in silence again, but it was a different kind now. Not guarded, not heavy. It felt earned. The kind of quiet that follows honesty, not avoidance. Keanu leaned back slightly still, facing him fully. He did not change the subject. He did not steer them away from what had been said. He respected the weight of it enough to let it breathe. The old man's gaze drifted toward the Christmas tree by the window. The lights reflected faintly in the glass, doubling themselves, blurring slightly with the snow falling outside. He noticed the reflection of those lights in Keanu's eyes as well when he looked back. It struck him then unexpectedly how present Keanu was. Not performing attentiveness, living it. "I don't usually tell anyone all that," the old man admitted. "Feels strange." Keanu nodded. "It can. Being heard sometimes does." That answer did not try to explain the feeling away. It acknowledged it. The old man felt something loosen slightly in his shoulders, as if the effort of holding himself together could ease for a moment. He took a slow breath. "Most people don't want the long version," he said. "They want something quick they can understand." Keanu met his eyes. "The long version matters." The old man sat with that, absorbing it fully. For years, his life had been reduced to fragments. A label, a glance, a passing assumption. No one had stayed long enough to hear how 1 year became 20, how grief wore him down instead of breaking him all at once. Now someone was staying. The diner continued around them unchanged. The tree lights blinked on and off. Coffee cooled in their cups. Outside, the snow kept falling indifferent to time. Inside, that booth restraint had become its own kind of gift. Keanu had not fixed anything. He had not promised tomorrow would be different. He had not reached for solutions that might close the story too soon. He had listened. And for the man who had spent decades feeling unseen, that act alone was already changing the shape of the night. The old man rested his forearms on the table, fingers loosely intertwined, as if grounding himself in the moment. He seemed smaller now, not in presence, but in vulnerability, as though setting the weight down had taken effort. He glanced toward the window again, watching the snow drift past the glass, then spoke more quietly. "Most nights, nobody asks," he said, "and after a while you stop thinking anyone should." Keanu did not rush to counter that thought. He let it stand, respecting its truth. His expression did not harden with anger or soften with pity. It stayed calm, attentive, steady. The kind of presence that did not require performance. The old man shifted again, a hint of discomfort returning. "I'm not looking for anything," he added quickly. "Didn't mean for it to sound like that." Keanu leaned forward slightly, closing the distance just enough to signal care. "I know," he said. "You're not asking for anything." That reassurance mattered. The old man's shoulders eased. He nodded, accepting it. The need to defend himself faded, replaced by something gentler. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The silence held shaped now by trust rather than uncertainty. The Christmas tree lights blinked softly beside them, their reflection shimmering across the tabletop and into the old man's eyes. He noticed it then, how the light made everything feel less sharp, less temporary. "I forgot what it was like," he said, almost to himself, "to talk and not feel like I have to wrap it up fast." Keanu smiled faintly. "You don't have to here." The old man looked at him, really looked this time. He saw no urgency there, no impatience, no need to manage the moment. That steadiness stirred something deep and unexpected. Gratitude, yes, but also relief. He exhaled slowly, a long breath that seemed to carry years with it. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, "for listening." Keanu met his gaze. "Thank you for trusting me with it." The words settled gently between them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in quiet layers. Inside, the diner remained warm and unchanged. The coffee had cooled. The plates were empty. Yet something essential had been exchanged. Nothing had been promised. Nothing had been fixed. But a man who had felt invisible for decades had been fully seen. And that, for this moment, was enough. They stepped back out into the night together, the diner door closing softly behind them with a muted chime. The warmth lingered for only a second before the cold reclaimed the space around them. Snow was falling heavier now, thick flakes drifting down in steady silence, covering the street in fresh white. The world felt quieter than before, as if the city itself had slowed to match their pace. Keanu paused just outside the door, giving the old man a moment to adjust. The coat still rested securely on his shoulders, its collar turned up against the wind. The old man pulled it tighter instinctively, the fabric already familiar. The smell of soap and pine followed him into the cold, a small reminder of warmth that had not yet faded. They stood side by side on the sidewalk, neither in a hurry to move. The diner window glowed behind them, the uneven Christmas tree still visible through the fogged glass. Its lights blurred slightly as snow gathered on the pane. For a moment, it felt like leaving something fragile behind. Keanu glanced at the man, assessing him quietly. He checked the way the coat sat, the way the man stood, the steadiness of his breath. He did not ask many questions. He did not interrogate the night. He simply made sure the essentials were covered. "You warm enough?" he asked. The old man nodded. "Warmer than I've been in a while." Keanu accepted that answer without comment. He reached into his pocket and handed the man a small paper bag he had picked up inside. Inside were a few wrapped items, simple things meant to last through the night. He did not explain them. He did not frame them as help. He placed them in the man's hands and closed his fingers gently around them, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The old man looked down at the bag, then back up, uncertainty flickering briefly across his face. He hesitated, then nodded again, accepting it. Pride stirred, then settled. Tonight had already taught him that accepting did not always mean losing something. They began to walk together for a short distance, snow crunching beneath their steps. Streetlights cast long, soft shadows that moved with them, stretching and shortening as they passed. Neither spoke much. Words felt unnecessary now. The quiet between them carried understanding instead of distance. At the corner they slowed. This was where their paths would separate. The old man stopped first, turning to face Keanu. Snow clung to his hat and the shoulders of the coat, softening his outline. His expression was calm, but something deeper moved beneath it. Gratitude tempered by the belief that moments like this were rare and fleeting. "I won't forget tonight," he said. His voice was steady, sincere. "Thank you for everything." Keanu met his gaze, holding it without flinching. "I'm glad we met," he said simply. The old man nodded. He did not ask for a name. He did not ask where Keanu was going or what would happen next. He had learned not to push moments past where they wanted to end. He assumed, as he always did, that this kindness would live in memory more than in continuation. He extended his hand. Keanu took it without hesitation. Their grip was firm, warm despite the cold, a quiet exchange of respect. Then they released. The old man stepped back, adjusting the coat once more. "Take care," he said. "You too," Keanu replied. They stood there for a final second, snow falling between them before the old man turned and walked away, disappearing slowly into the white-lit street. Keanu remained where he was watching until the man's figure blended into the night. The old man did not look back. He did not need to. In his mind, the night had already taken its place among other rare memories. A Christmas Eve meal, a tree by a window, a stranger who listened. He had no way of knowing that this was not the end of the care. It was only the beginning. The snow swallowed the old man's footsteps, almost immediately erasing the path he had taken, as if he had never been there. He walked with the coat pulled tight, the paper bag tucked safely beneath it, his head lowered against the wind. Each step felt heavier with fatigue, yet lighter with something unfamiliar. Warmth lingered not just on his skin, but deeper settled in his chest. He did not expect anything more from the night. Experience had taught him not to. Kindness, when it appeared, was usually brief, meant to be held gently and released without demand. He carried it the way he carried the memory of the tree in the diner carefully, so it would not break under the weight of hope. Behind him, Keanu remained standing on the corner for a moment longer, snow collecting on his shoulders again. He did not call out. He did not offer instructions or reassurance. He watched until the man was safely out of sight, then turned in the opposite direction. His steps were unhurried, purposeful, already moving beyond the moment without abandoning it. The old man reached a quiet stretch of sidewalk and paused beneath a streetlight. He adjusted the coat once more, feeling its weight settle properly across his back. He looked up at the falling snow and let it land on his face, cold and clean. Tomorrow would come as it always did. Morning would bring the same uncertainties. But tonight had been different, and that difference mattered. He whispered a thank you into the air, unsure who it was meant for. Perhaps the man from the diner, perhaps the night itself, perhaps something he had stopped believing listened anymore. Then he continued on, blending into the city's shadows, carrying with him the belief that this kindness would fade with the snow by morning. He was wrong. That misunderstanding would soon be challenged in ways he could not imagine, quietly, deliberately, with no audience, no announcements, only actions unfolding after the lights dimmed, long after Christmas Eve ended, and long after he believed the night had finished giving him. What happened next did not take place under Christmas lights or warm diner windows. There were no witnesses, no gestures meant to be remembered. When the night ended and the city settled into sleep, Keanu Reeves continued quietly, deliberately, without signaling that anything extraordinary was underway. The first call came early the next morning. No announcement, no explanation beyond what was necessary. A request for a room, temporary, warm, private, a place where a man could sleep without bracing for noise or cold. Arrangements were made quickly, efficiently, without fanfare. By the time the sun rose fully, a door was waiting to be opened. Keanu did not accompany him publicly. He did not create a moment. He ensured the man knew where to go and that someone would be there to receive him without questions. A bed, clean sheets, heat that stayed on through the night. These were not gifts meant to impress. They were foundations. Next came food. Not a single meal, but a plan. Regular meals, simple, nourishing, predictable, the kind that restored rhythm as much as strength. He made sure it would not feel like charity. No lines, no forms to fill out on day one, just eating, resting, stabilizing. Clothes followed, clean clothes that fit, nothing extravagant. Shirts that did not carry the weight of winter streets. Shoes with intact soles, socks that did not require rationing. The man accepted them quietly, still expecting some invisible cost. None came. Keanu did not hover. He did not manage the process personally in visible ways. He worked through people who understood discretion, people who knew how to help without turning help into spectacle. There were no photographs, no posts, no mentions of names, nothing that would turn a private recovery into a public story. The next step took longer. Paperwork always did. Keanu contacted veteran support organizations, not with urgency meant to bypass process, but with respect for it. He listened. He explained. He waited. Records were requested, service histories traced, old files reopened. This part required patience. Forms, verifications, phone calls that ended with instructions to call back another day. He accepted all of it. The man's identity had not vanished. It had simply become difficult to access. That distinction mattered. Medical checkups were scheduled quietly. Nothing dramatic. Just assessments that had been overdue for years. Blood pressure, nutrition, lingering injuries that had never been addressed because survival came first. The man approached these appointments cautiously, unused to being asked how he felt without suspicion. Keanu did not promise outcomes. He did not guarantee timelines. He ensured continuity, that someone would follow up, that no single appointment would become another dead end. As days passed, Christmas decorations came down across the city. Trees were dragged to curbs, lights went dark, holiday music faded from radios. For most people, the season ended and life resumed. For the man who had sat on church steps, life was only beginning to reassemble. And almost no one knew it was happening. There were no speeches about second chances, no headlines, no shared images of generosity, only quiet progress made after the attention had moved elsewhere, only stability built when no one was watching. This was the part that mattered most, the part that did not glow, the part that lasted. The man moved into the room quietly, almost cautiously, as if sound itself might alert someone that he did not belong there. He sat on the edge of the bed, at first hands resting on his knees, waiting for permission, that did not need to be given. The mattress dipped under his weight and stayed that way. The heat did not shut off. The silence did not feel dangerous. That alone took time to trust. In the following days, routines replaced vigilance. Meals arrived at regular hours. Not leftovers, not whatever was available. Actual meals, warm and consistent. He learned he could sleep through the night without waking at every noise. That no one would knock on the door to tell him to move along. That the door would still be locked when he closed it behind him. Keanu did not appear again. That was intentional. Help continued without presence. Support without shadow. The man was allowed space to recover without feeling watched or managed. People checked in, but gently. Social workers who spoke plainly, veterans advocates who knew how to listen without rushing. No one asked him to retell his story unless he wanted to. Paperwork became part of the routine. Slow, frustrating, but steady. Birth records were located. Military service confirmed. An identification card reissued. Each document returned felt like a piece of himself being handed back. Not new, recovered. He held them carefully, afraid they might disappear again if handled too roughly. Medical visits followed, blood work, scans, conversations that acknowledged years of neglect without judgment. He learned the names of conditions he had lived with silently. He learned that pain did not have to be normal, that fatigue did not have to be permanent. None of it changed overnight, but it changed direction. Winter passed. Snow melted into slush. Days lengthened. The city moved on from Christmas. The man noticed this without fear. For once, the passing of a season did not mean displacement. It meant progress. He began to speak more during appointments, to ask questions, to plan small things. A walk around the block, a cup of coffee in the morning instead of late at night. The idea of tomorrow stopped feeling abstract. At no point did Keanu step forward to claim credit. No one told the man who had arranged it all. That, too, was deliberate. Gratitude can become a burden when it is directed upward instead of inward. What mattered was stability, not acknowledgement. The real work happened quietly. In waiting rooms, in signed forms, in uninterrupted sleep, in meals eaten without fear of interruption. This was not a miracle. It was maintenance, the kind that holds when attention fades. Long after the lights were gone, long after the holiday stories ended, something rare was happening. A life was being rebuilt slowly, carefully, without applause. And that was exactly how it was meant to be. The envelope arrived without ceremony. Plain, white. His name typed neatly on the front. When the staff member handed it to him, she spoke it out loud, clearly, as if it mattered that the sound filled the room. His name. He froze for a moment, fingers tightening around the envelope. It had been a long time since anyone had said it with certainty. On the streets, names were optional. In shelters, they were often replaced by numbers or first initials scribbled on clipboards. Over the years, his name had faded from daily use, existing more as a memory than a fact. He sat down before opening the envelope, steadying himself. Inside were documents he had not held in decades. Identification, proof, evidence that he existed beyond the present moment. His photograph stared back at him from the card, updated, unfamiliar, but undeniably his. Older, thinner, marked by time. Still him. He turned the card over in his hands, slowly, afraid that moving too quickly might break something. The weight of it was small, but the meaning was immense. This was not just plastic and ink. This was permission to belong again. The verification of his military service followed soon after. Records retrieved, dates confirmed, a history that had never disappeared, only been buried beneath years of paperwork and neglect. When the Veteran Services officer addressed him, she did so with respect, using his full name, acknowledging his service without hesitation. "Thank you for your service," she said simply, sincerely. He nodded, unsure how to respond. Gratitude had always been complicated for him. But this felt different. This was not ceremonial. This was recognition. With each appointment, each signature, something shifted. Staff spoke to him directly, not around him. He was asked questions that assumed a future. Where would you like to live? What do you need? What matters to you? These were not survival questions. They were belonging questions. One afternoon, back in his room, he stood in front of the mirror for a long time. Not the quick glance he had grown used to, the kind meant to check for danger or disapproval. This time he looked fully. The man staring back at him looked older than he remembered. His hair was thinner. His face carried lines that had not been there when he last felt known. But his eyes were steady, familiar. They held a clarity he had not seen in years. He touched his face lightly, as if confirming it was real. For the first time in decades, he did not feel like a placeholder. He felt like a person whose life had continuity, past, present, name. Surviving had required him to become smaller, quieter, less defined. Belonging asked the opposite. It asked him to take up space again, to answer when spoken to sign his name instead of marking an X. He folded the documents carefully and placed them in the drawer beside his bed, not hidden, not guarded obsessively, just stored where important things belonged. Later that day, someone called him by name again in the hallway. He turned without hesitation. It felt natural. For the first time in a very long while, the man who had sat on church steps on Christmas Eve recognized himself not as someone passing through the world unnoticed, but as someone who had returned to it. And this time, the world was calling him by name. The days that followed felt different, not dramatic, but steadier. Each morning began with routine instead of uncertainty. He woke but knowing where he was, knowing his name was attached to the door and the paperwork waiting on the table. When staff greeted him, they used it naturally without hesitation, and he answered without flinching. That simple exchange changed the way he carried himself. His shoulders lifted slightly, his steps slowed. He was no longer bracing for correction or dismissal. He was being addressed, not managed. During one appointment, a clerk slid a form across the desk and asked him to sign. He hesitated, pen hovering, then wrote his full name carefully, letter by letter. The act felt ceremonial, as if each stroke was reclaiming something misplaced long ago. His military history was confirmed in quiet conversations and stamped documents. No applause, no speeches, just acknowledgement. A nod from a veteran advocate who spoke to him as an equal, not a case. That respect settled deeply. Reaching places food and shelter could not. In the mirror, he practiced meeting his own gaze. At first it felt unfamiliar, then it felt honest. He saw the soldier he had been and the man he had become standing in the same body, finally connected. He began to think in longer terms, not just tonight or this week, but months. He considered what kind of mornings he wanted, what work might look like, whether he could belong somewhere again. These thoughts did not frighten him. They steadied him. When someone called his name from across the room, he responded immediately. No delay, no calculation. He was not weighing whether he deserved to answer. He simply did. Identity had returned before confidence, but confidence followed, slowly, naturally. He was still cautious, still learning, but he was no longer invisible to himself. At night, he placed the documents back into the drawer, not as a shield, but as assurance. Proof that erosion was not the end of a story. Proof that restoration could begin quietly. This was what dignity looked like when it returned. Not loud, not sudden, but steady, grounded, named. The man who had waited on church steps was no longer waiting to be recognized. He had been recognized, and with his name restored, he began to live as himself again. Belonging arrived in ordinary moments, in conversations that assumed presence, in choices that assumed future. He noticed how different it felt to be included without explanation, to be asked opinions, to be expected to return. The mirror no longer startled him. It reminded him. He stood taller, not from pride, but alignment. His past and present no longer argued. They spoke quietly together. In that balance, healing continued. Slowly, honestly, without spectacle. A name reclaimed, a life resumed, and a man once lost to silence found himself again, not as a symbol, but as someone who belonged. The world did not change around him. He changed within it, quietly, completely. With his name intact, he stepped forward, ready to live the rest of his days visible, counted, and present. That was the beginning of belonging, and it held more promise than survival ever had alone now or before finally, firmly, and truly his own. Christmas morning arrived quietly. No bells, no announcements. Just light filtering through thin curtains and settling gently across the room. The old man woke slowly, not startled, not bracing for noise or cold. For a moment he stayed still, listening. The heater hummed softly. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. Normal sounds, safe sounds. He realized then that he was warm. The thought landed gently, almost cautiously, as if it needed confirmation. He shifted beneath the blanket, feeling the weight of it, the way it held heat, instead of letting it escape. His feet were warm, his hands were warm. There was no ache from cold stone or frozen air, no urgency to move before daylight brought displacement. He sat up and let his feet touch the floor. The surface was cool, but not punishing. He stood without rushing, without calculating how much time he had before someone noticed him. That absence of pressure felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. A small table stood near the window. On it rested a cup and a simple coffee maker already prepared by someone he had not seen. He poured the coffee slowly, watching steam rise, watching it curl and fade. The smell filled the room, rich and grounding. He carried the cup to the window and sat down. Outside, the city looked different in the early morning. Snow lay undisturbed on rooftops and sidewalks, smoothing sharp edges, softening everything it touched. Cars passed occasionally, slower than usual. The world felt paused, as if giving itself permission to breathe. There was no Christmas tree in the room, no ornaments, no lights blinking in the corner. And yet the absence did not feel like loss. It felt like space, peace. He wrapped both hands around the mug and held it there, letting the heat seep into his palms. He took a small sip, careful not to rush it. The coffee tasted stronger than he remembered, or maybe he was just more present. Each sensation felt clearer this morning, sharper, more honest. As he sat there, something inside him finally gave way. The tears came quietly. No sobs, no shaking. Just a steady release that surprised him with its gentleness. They rolled down his cheeks without resistance, warm against his skin. He did not wipe them away right away. He let them fall. These were not tears of sadness, not grief, not regret. They were something else entirely. Relief. Relief that he had slept through the night. Relief that no one had told him to move. Relief that his name existed again somewhere beyond his memory. Relief that he was not alone in the world, even if the room itself was quiet. He breathed in slowly and let it out, shoulders rising and falling in a rhythm he had not felt in years. The weight he had carried for so long, the constant readiness for loss, eased its grip just enough for him to notice the difference. He thought briefly of the diner, of the uneven Christmas tree by the window, of the man who had sat across from him without rushing, without fixing. He did not attach expectations to those memories. He did not assume they meant more was coming. He let them be what they were, a gift. The light outside grew brighter as the morning moved forward. Somewhere in the building, voices murmured, dishes clinked. Life continued at a gentle pace. He took another sip of coffee and closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to be fully present in the warmth, in the quiet, in the simple fact of being here. This Christmas morning did not look like the ones he remembered from long ago. There were no wrapped boxes, no tree to decorate, no table set for many. But for the first time in decades, he did not feel forgotten. And that was more than enough. After a while, the tears stopped on their own. He took a steadying breath and noticed how quiet his body felt, as if it no longer needed to stay alert for danger. The room held him without asking anything in return. That realization felt new, and it stayed. He finished the coffee, slowly savoring the last warmth at the bottom of the cup. When he stood, there was no rush. He rinsed the mug and set it upside down on a towel, a small domestic act that made him pause. It felt like proof that he belonged here, even if only for now. He moved back to the window and watched the street wake up. A couple walked by with their collars turned up, laughing softly. A delivery truck idled, then rolled forward. Snow slipped from a tree branch and scattered on the sidewalk. Ordinary moments unfolded without spectacle, and he felt grateful to witness them. He did not think about what would happen next. Not today. Today was for noticing, for acknowledging the quiet mercy of a warm morning and a calm mind. He pressed his fingertips together and felt steadiness instead of tremor. In the mirror by the door, he caught his reflection again. His eyes were red but clear. He nodded to himself, not in triumph, but in acceptance. He was still cautious, still learning how to trust. But he was here. He pulled on the coat and stood for a moment, feeling its weight settle. It reminded him of the night before, of the diner lights, and the patient listening. He held that memory lightly without turning it into expectation. When he stepped into the hallway, the air smelled faintly of soap and coffee. Someone greeted him by name, simple and unremarkable. He answered just as simply. Christmas morning continued gentle and unassuming. There were no promises attached to it, no audience, just a quiet understanding that survival had shifted into something kinder. For the first time in years, he let the day arrive without bracing for loss. He let gratitude exist without apology. And as the morning unfolded, he felt a calm certainty take root. This was a different kind of Christmas, and it was enough. Nothing asked him to prove himself today, and that freedom felt like a gift he could finally accept, hold briefly, and carry forward with care into the coming days. A year passed quietly and without announcement. No dramatic markers, no single moment that defined the change, just days stacking gently on top of one another, steady enough to hold weight. By the time winter returned, the man was healthier. Not transformed, not reinvented, simply grounded. His face carried more color now, his hands were steadier. The constant tension that once lived in his shoulders had eased into something closer to ease. He still moved carefully, still chose silence more often than words, but the silence no longer came from fear. It came from comfort. He lived modestly. A small room, simple routines, morning coffee, evening walks. He kept what he needed and little more. Stability had taught him that excess was not the same as safety. What mattered was knowing where he would sleep, who to call, and that tomorrow would arrive without demanding proof of worth. A few days a week he volunteered. Nothing formal at first. He helped organize supplies, sat with men who reminded him of who he had been not long ago, veterans mostly, men who carried their stories in their posture, in the way they scanned rooms, in the way they avoided eye contact, until trust earned it. He never forced conversation. He knew better than that. Sometimes he just poured coffee and slid it across a table. Sometimes he listened. When someone asked how long it had taken him to get back on his feet, he answered honestly. Longer than I expected, he would say, shorter than I feared. Christmas approached again, slowly this time. Decorations returned to storefronts. Lights went up. Music drifted through streets and open doors. He noticed it all without flinching. The season no longer felt like a test. One evening, walking home from the center, he took a different route. Snow had begun to fall again, light and patient. The city felt familiar now, no longer something he moved through defensively. He walked with his hands in his pockets, breath steady steps, unhurried. He stopped without realizing why. Across the street, a small diner glowed softly against the dark, vinyl booths visible through the window, steam clouding the glass. And near the front, a Christmas tree stood, slightly uneven lights wrapped loosely around its branches. He did not cross the street. He did not go inside. He simply stood there watching. The memory came back instantly. The warmth, the coffee, the silence that had not rushed him. The man who had listened without fixing. The first Christmas tree he had sat beside in 20 years. A smile touched his face, brief and private. He did not stay long. He did not need to. Some moments were meant to be held quietly, not revisited. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging something sacred. Then he continued walking the snow, soft beneath his boots, carrying with him the understanding that one night, one table, one act of quiet attention had changed the direction of his life. And it had stayed changed. He walked on, leaving the diner behind him, but the warmth of that memory stayed close, settled, deep, rather than sharp. It did not pull him backward. It reminded him how far he had come. Over the past year, he had learned something important. Healing was not loud. It did not arrive all at once. It showed itself in ordinary moments, in waking up without fear, in answering the phone without hesitation, in being asked for help and knowing he could give it without losing himself. At the Veterans Center, people had started to recognize him as someone steady, someone who understood without needing to explain too much. New faces came in carrying the same guarded expressions he once wore. He never rushed them. He knew that trust had its own pace. When a man sat across from him, eyes lowered, hands shaking slightly around a cup of coffee, he did not fill the silence. He let it breathe. Sometimes that was enough to open a door. He never told the full story unless asked. When he did, he kept it simple. He spoke about erosion instead of failure, about how losing your footing did not mean you had never stood tall. Those words mattered to people who had begun to believe their worst moments defined them. Christmas week arrived, and with it came invitations. A modest gathering at the center. A shared meal. No pressure. No obligation. He attended quietly, helping where needed, stepping back when not. He noticed how different it felt to be expected somewhere, even without fanfare. On Christmas Eve, he took a short walk before dusk. Snow fell lightly, just enough to soften the edges of the world. He passed churches with doors open, light spilling out onto the steps. He felt no pull of pain this time, only awareness. He thought briefly of the man who had noticed him a year ago. He did not know where he was now. He did not know if their paths would ever cross again. That uncertainty no longer troubled him. Gratitude did not require proximity. What mattered was what had been modeled for him that night. Attention without judgment, help without ownership, care without conditions. He had carried those lessons into his own life, passing them forward quietly without announcement. Later that evening, back in his room, he sat by the window again. No tree, no decorations, just the city glowing gently under falling snow. He made himself a cup of coffee and held it the same way he had a year earlier, hands wrapped around warmth. This time, there were no tears. There was peace. He understood now that some nights were not meant to be repeated. They were meant to be remembered. That diner, that tree, that silence filled with presence. It had become part of him, woven into how he moved through the world. As midnight approached, he stood, turned off the light, and prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would come, not as a threat, not as a question, just as another day. And as Christmas settled quietly over the city, the man who had once sat unseen on church steps rested, fully grounded in the knowledge that he belonged not because of what had been done for him, but because he had learned how to stand again, steady and present, carrying one sacred memory that would always remind him where the change began. There was a sentence the man carried with him. One he did not say often, but never forgot. The Christmas tree in the diner that night was the only Christmas tree he had sat next to in 20 years. When he first realized it, the truth of it had stunned him, not because he had counted the years before, but because the number made visible something he had learned to keep vague. 20 years without a tree was not about decorations. It was about absence, about standing outside windows and moving on, about avoiding places that reminded him of what he no longer had. The tree in the diner had not been grand. It leaned slightly. The lights were uneven, the ornaments did not match, and yet it had done something nothing else had done in 2 decades. It had placed him somewhere he belonged. Sitting beside that tree, he had not felt like a visitor. He had not felt tolerated. He had not felt like someone being helped for a moment before being returned to the cold. He had felt seated, included, allowed to stay. The tree had not asked questions or required explanations. It had simply glowed steady and patient, as if it expected him to be there. That expectation mattered. For years, Christmas had arrived like a reminder of exclusion. Not loud or cruel, just persistent. Trees behind glass, laughter carried on cold air, the knowledge that others had places reserved for them. The diner tree changed that equation in a single evening. It did not erase the past. It interrupted it. Belonging, he learned, did not always arrive with invitations or names written on place cards. Sometimes it arrived with a booth by a window, a cup of coffee, and someone willing to sit without rushing. The tree marked that space. It signaled that this was a place where time slowed, where presence mattered more than productivity, where a man could exist without being evaluated. He understood later why that moment stayed with him. Loneliness, he realized, was not cured by crowds or noise. It was interrupted by attention, by someone noticing and choosing not to look away. The tree had been a witness to that choice, a quiet confirmation that the night had changed course. In the years that followed, he saw other trees, in stores, in offices, in community centers. They no longer triggered the same ache. Instead, they reminded him of what was possible, that even a modest space, imperfect and unplanned, could become sacred if the right thing happened there. The diner tree had become a symbol not of Christmas, but of interruption. Proof that decades of isolation could be paused. Proof that dignity could be restored without ceremony. Proof that kindness did not need to be grand to be permanent. He never tried to recreate that night. He never sought out the same booth or ordered the same meal. Moments like that did not repeat themselves. They anchored you. They gave you a reference point for what the world could be when someone chose presence over passing by. When he told others about it, he did not emphasize the help that followed. He spoke about the tree, about sitting beside it, about how it felt to be warm and unhurried while snow fell outside, about how one evening of belonging had shifted something inside him that 20 years of endurance had not. The tree had not saved him. It had shown him he was worth saving. And that understanding stayed with him steady and quiet, long after the lights were taken down, long after the season passed, long after the diner window no longer glowed into the night. What stayed with him most was how ordinary the moment had been. No announcement, no turning point declared out loud. The tree did not sparkle brighter when he sat down. The diner did not pause to acknowledge anything special. And yet something permanent had taken root in that quiet ordinariness. For 20 years, loneliness had taught him to expect distance. It had trained him to accept that some spaces were not meant for him. The diner tree disrupted that belief without argument. It did not convince him with words. It simply allowed him to exist nearby without conditions, without hurry. That was the gift. Belonging, he learned, is not about being welcomed loudly. It is about being allowed to stay. The tree stood beside him while he ate. It stayed while he spoke. It stayed while he was silent. It did not disappear when the meal ended. It remained steady, as if marking time differently. Years later, when he sat with other veterans who felt erased by time, he never started with advice. He started with attention. He sat where they could see him. He stayed when conversation slowed. He understood now that what people remembered was not what you gave them, but how long you stayed present. The tree had taught him that. He realized, too, that kindness did not always announce itself as kindness. Often it looked like patience, like listening without redirecting, like sharing space without ownership. Those were the qualities that had interrupted his isolation far more effectively than any speech or promise ever could. When Christmas returned each year, he no longer measured it by what he lacked. He measured it by what he could offer. A seat, a cup of coffee, a few minutes without interruption. These were small things, but he knew better now than to underestimate them. The memory of the tree did not make him nostalgic. It made him attentive. It reminded him to watch for the moments when someone hovered just outside the light, unsure if they were allowed in. It reminded him that a single evening could redirect a life without ever announcing itself as important. The diner tree had not been magical. It had not fixed anything on its own, but it had stood in the right place at the right time while the right choice was made beside it. That was enough. In the end, the meaning of that tree was simple and profound. It proved that loneliness, no matter how long it lasted, was not final. That it could be interrupted. That it could be challenged. That it could be softened by one night of presence. And once interrupted, it did not always return with the same force. The tree had marked the moment when survival shifted toward belonging. Not because the world suddenly changed, but because one man had been seen aloud and remembered himself again. That was the meaning he carried forward. Quiet, steady, unmistakable. Christmas is often measured by what is visible: lights, gifts, tables filled with food, voices gathered in warm rooms. But the quiet truth of the season lives somewhere else. It lives in attention, in who we notice, in who we slow down for when the night is cold and the world feels busy moving on. The story you have just heard was never about a miracle in the dramatic sense. No sudden transformation, no loud redemption. It was about a moment most people would have missed: an old man sitting just outside the light. A Christmas Eve where warmth existed inches away, separated only by glass and timing, and one person who chose not to walk past. Keanu Reeves was not a hero in that moment. He did not arrive to save anyone. He did not speak loudly or announce himself. He did not fix a life in a single night. He did something far simpler and far rarer. He noticed. He stayed. He listened. He shared warmth without asking for recognition. That choice mattered more than anything that followed, because the truth is, most lives do not fall apart all at once. They erode, slowly, quietly, one missed step at a time. And in the same way, healing rarely arrives all at once. It begins with interruption, with someone choosing to pause long enough to say, "I see you. You can sit here. You can stay." The Christmas tree in that diner did not sparkle because it was special. It mattered because of what happened beside it, because it marked the moment when loneliness was interrupted. When a man who had survived 20 years of silence was finally allowed to belong, if only for one evening. That is what Christmas offers when we let it. Not abundance, but attention. Not excess, but presence. Not noise, but warmth shared intentionally. As you reflect on this story, remember that there are people sitting just outside the light every day. On church steps, on sidewalks, in quiet corners where no one is looking anymore. They do not always ask. Often they have learned not to. What they need first is not fixing. It is being seen. You do not need fame to do what Keanu Reeves did. You do not need money or influence. You need time, patience, willingness to sit without rushing. A cup of coffee, a meal shared, a conversation that does not hurry toward solutions. One warm dinner can change a life, not because it fills a stomach, but because it restores dignity, because it reminds someone that they are not invisible, that their story matters, that they are still part of the world. This Christmas and every season after, look for the quiet moments, the overlooked people, the spaces just outside the glow. Choose attention over passing by, presence over performance, kindness that does not need to be documented to be real. Because sometimes the smallest acts done quietly carry the power to change everything. And that is the true gift of Christmas. If this story stirred something in you, that feeling matters. It is not meant to fade when the screen goes dark. It is meant to travel with you into the ordinary moments of your own life, into parking lots and sidewalks, into restaurants closing late, into places where someone may be sitting quietly hoping not to be noticed and wishing at the same time that they would be. Christmas has a way of revealing contrasts: warmth beside cold, full tables beside empty hands, celebration beside silence. Most of the time we move past those contrasts quickly because they make us uncomfortable. We tell ourselves there is nothing we can do, that someone else will handle it, that kindness requires resources we do not have. But this story shows something different. Change does not always begin with solutions. It begins with attention, with the decision to stop for one moment longer, to ask a simple question, to offer presence without conditions. Those moments rarely look important at the time. They feel small, almost forgettable. Yet they can become sacred in the memory of someone who has gone years without being seen. Keanu Reeves did not know what would follow that night. He did not promise outcomes. He did not offer speeches or assurances. He simply acted in alignment with his humanity. And that alignment set everything else in motion. You are capable of the same alignment. Maybe it looks like sitting with someone a little longer than planned. Maybe it looks like listening without redirecting the conversation. Maybe it looks like sharing a meal without framing it as charity. Or noticing someone others have learned to look past. These acts may never be acknowledged publicly. They may never be thanked. That does not make them small. Often the most meaningful kindnesses are the ones no one sees. As this season continues, take a moment to ask yourself a quiet question. Who is sitting just outside the light in my world? And what would it look like to simply notice them? If this story reminded you of someone you once overlooked, let that reminder guide you gently. If it reminded you of a time you felt unseen, yourself, let it assure you that attention can return sometimes in the most unexpected ways. And now we invite you to reflect. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone's quiet kindness changed the direction of your life, even briefly? Or have you ever been that person for someone else without realizing it at the time? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story may become the light someone else needs. And if you believe that stories like this matter, stories about dignity, patience, and quiet humanity, consider staying with us. Subscribe for more moments that remind us who we can be when we choose to see one another fully. Because sometimes all it takes to change a life is one evening, one meal, one decision not to walk past. And that choice is available to all of us every day.